Hello again and welcome to Class 2B. I hope you enjoyed Class 2A. So before we go on to 2B though, there's one thing I forgot to talk about in Class 2A, and that is these things. So what you see on this slide is a BBC news story from January 2018 about how in Scotland there was a proposal to ban the plastic cotton buds, and this came on the back of a wider public awareness, I guess is a way of putting it, about the damage single-use plastics were doing to the environment because of the energy invested in them and also the time they take to biodegrade. And this focused on, things like cotton buds, which is what this is called in the UK, called Q-tips elsewhere in the world, or some places anyway, and also, packaging for food, plastic bottled water, etc., and even the plastics involved in coffee cups. And that's why I now have a reusable coffee cup rather than using the one from you get from the shop and just throwing it in the bin when you're not using it. So in the news story here, there's a story about how hundreds of these things were found on the beach. So the question is, how did they get there and why is it relevant to this course, perhaps, is a more important question. Well, remember we're talking about the 6mm screens in the last lecture. Well, cotton buds can quite easily get through a 6mm screen because their cross-section is less than 6mm, even though they're much longer than 6mm. Looks about, 70mm long. So they quite easily get through CSO screens or through screens at treatment works. And I don't doubt that the majority of those cotton buds there have went through CSO screens or perhaps a screen at treatment works. So the question is, I guess, is banning plastic cotton buds the solution? Perhaps that's part of the solution, or should we be thinking about getting people to put these things down their WC less, or maybe we should be designing CSOs to stop them from passing forward, and also screens at treatment works to stop them from getting passed into the environment. If you've got an idea for that, you can contact the Dragon's Den, and you might be able to support you. Okay, on to Class 2B. So in the last class we spoke about the difference between combined and separate systems, and we also spoke about the CSOs. Now in this class what we want to do is talk about file inputs to systems, and in the next class 3A and 3B we'll talk about rainwater inputs to systems. Before I start this, I'm just going to close my blind because I can see the sun striking on one side of my face. Better. So the nature of wastewater. So the file flows, well, the flows going into a file, the file part of a network really comprise four things: your domestic residential inputs from commercial and industrial premises, and also your infiltration. So remember, infiltration is where groundwater is moving through holes or cracks in the pipe into the pipe and getting conveyed to treatment. Inflow are connections which are maybe properly formed, but you're not aware of them, either because the paperwork for the system is not up to date, or because someone's connected to the network without telling you as an engineer. So we expect these inputs to vary based on geographical location, population, the industry and commercial types, both, and that's important both in terms of the quality and quantity of the inflow, system characteristics and conditions. So obviously a poorly maintained pipe network which is below the water table and which is quite old is much more likely to suffer from infiltration as opposed to a nice new network which is above the water table level. If you take those two extremes, and that's where that becomes important. So, the starting point often for estimating fire flows into a new network is to think about water consumption levels, because in most parts of the world there is, well, if you're aware of what your water consumption levels are, you can make an assumption about how much of that water will be returned to the sewer network. So in the UK we expect water usage levels to be somewhere between 148 and 200 litres per head per day. There's been lots of surveys to quantify this. All of them give different results, but 140 to 200 is the sort of broad range you would expect the UK to fall within. Average consumption levels can be used to estimate inputs to the sewer network. In the UK we tend to estimate around 95% of water supplied to households will be returned to the network. In warmer climates this can be less, and also lifestyle factors are quite important. So you live in a part of the world where people tend to irrigate their garden, have swimming pools, and the climate's a bit warmer, you would expect water usage to be much higher than, say, Scotland or the UK, where people, not everyone waters their gardens, and they tend only to do it in the summertime. I've never seen anybody do it in the wintertime. And very few people have things like swimming pools. Ironically, quite often in the warmer climates where people are irrigating their gardens quite a lot is because they're trying to recreate the kind of lawns which are quite common in the UK, but the local environment doesn't really support that because there's too much evaporation for the grass to thrive. Now, this plot shows water usage levels by household size, and what it shows is that for single person households, water usage levels is around 154 litres per day. For where you've got 6 or more people in a household, water usage levels can be around 123 litres per person per day. So that's around 1/6 less. And what's happening there is that the larger household benefits through economies of scale. So they're obviously sharing the water they use to wash their dishes, prepare food, and wash clothes, etc. If they've got children in the family, they may be sharing bath water as well. And now why this is almost interesting is that in most developed countries there's a drive towards having smaller households. So if this plot is correct, move towards smaller households means that water consumption will be higher if the population level stays the same. This is similar data from Southern Water, and what's interesting here is they estimate that 92.5% of their flow will be returned, of the water supply to households will be returned to their network. So that's broadly in line with the 95% I spoke about in the other slide. Now this graphic here shows where water is used in the household. Now from a wastewater perspective, obviously all these different water uses comes with different levels of pollutant loads. So obviously your WC has both the liquid and solid waste, let's be polite about it. Your bath and shower is obviously less polluted with that kind of waste, but there's detergents in it. Likewise your washing machine and your dishes, etc. as well. So they are pollutants, but polluted, but just in a different way. Now what's interesting about the shower, washing clothes, bath, and washing up is they combined they take up well over half of the water usage level in the home. The Now what's interesting about these water uses is that all of them involve heating the water. So even a small reduction in the amount of water used by in these ways has two benefits. Obviously, you're benefiting because the household is using less water, so that means the water supply companies invest in less energy in treating water and conveying it to these households, but also the householder is then spending less money heating the water to use it. So there's two benefits from reducing water usage in those areas. The problem with places like Scotland and parts of the rest of the UK is that water's not metered. So there's no real incentive for, if you look at water consumption alone, there's no real incentive for people to use less water because it's a flat charge. You can use as much as you like for that single charge for the whole household. And going back to a couple of slides ago, where you've got a single person household compared to a household that's got 6 or more people in it, those two households could potentially be paying exactly the same for their water usage. Water usage is certainly the charge in Scotland is based on the value of your property. I think sometime in the 1980s, and there's a sliding scale on that, so it's not based on usage levels at all, although you would expect more valuable properties in general to be larger properties, so therefore have more people in them. But the differences between the price paid by a small property and a large property is not that substantial. So you could argue that perhaps going to metering would encourage people to use less water, and that will save them money in terms of their water consumption bill and also their energy bill for these big warm water usages. Another interesting point here is average person is using 8 litres per day to flush their toilet, and that is the same as daily usage in the developing world, which is quite an incredible statistic. Now this slide shows water consumption around the world, and really why I put this here is it highlights that water consumption tends to be higher in highly developed economies where there's a warmer climate, so North America, Australia, New Zealand, and parts of the Middle East. It's where water consumption is highest here. Even where the country is highly developed, but water usage isn't quite so high where the climate's quite temperate. Right, so that's about water consumption in the home, but obviously quite a lot of the products we use in our home do come with quite a large water footprint. And now, as far as the sewer network's concerned, some of this water footprint will come in through your industrial and commercial uses, but it's worth thinking about this in a sort of broader scheme of things. So this slide really talks about agricultural products, so largely food, and you can see what it's suggesting is that a typical person is using around just over 3 cubic meters of water per day in the food that they consume, and so that's quite substantial when you think back to this, how much we fuss over the 150 to 200 litres per head per day we use in our households. Compare that to what's invested in the food, both agricultural products we consume. That's quite substantial. But this research looks at the differences between different types of diet and the invested water or the water footprint associated with those diets. And it makes a point that vegetarian diets tend to have a lower water footprint. I couldn't find data on a vegan diet, but I expect it's lower still. And this tallies in with research which was published in 2018 by, I think, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which said that the more meat we have in our diet, the more energy is invested in that diet, and suggesting that wasn't saying that people should become vegan or become vegetarian, but by eating less, less meats, we'll have a diet which has lower levels of energy invested in it. And what this graph also shows is will have a lower water footprint as well. There's a link there which you could follow if you want to look at this research more critically, or have a critical look at this research, but it's quite interesting work, I think. So what's supply and demand in the UK? So UK households, agriculture industry all demand water. Population growth means that we're using more water. As well as that, you look at bullet point 4, the way we're living as well has changed substantially, certainly over my lifetime, and we're now using more water in households. So we're much more likely to have devices like dishwashers and washing machines in our households now compared to, say, the 1950s, and that means we're using more water in our households. And I think as well as that, I think we are washing more. It's not unusual for someone to have 2 showers per day, one in the morning, one in the evening. Whereas I think my parents' generation, the thought of even having a bath every day would be quite unusual. And you know, when I was a kid, people used to joke about Sunday night being bath night, implying that perhaps people didn't wash to the same extent the other 6 days per week. Bottom slide, the data here is a bit dated, but it's talking about how population growth between 2009 and 2020 was expected to come with 5% increased demand, and that equates to 800 million litres of water per day. And bear in mind, all that water has to be returned to the sewer. Well, 95% of it has to be returned to the sewer network. So that means it's the job of the water supply company to think about where that development is going to take place, where in the towns and cities that they serve, where development is most likely, by looking at the development plans produced by local government. And of course, what the water supply company doesn't want, it doesn't want to be in a position where, you know, the government and the council or the local council is trying to promote economic development by progressing, you know, industrial, commercial and residential developments, but the lack of capacity in a sewer system is a barrier to doing that. So they have to think long term about where towns and cities are going to grow by working with local authorities and ensure the capacity is in place to do that. So in the long term, water demand is rising. I think that's fair to say, although there is exceptions to that, where, you know, in parts of the world where there's a scarcity, and there's been, you know, particularly in Australia, there's been quite determined efforts over quite a long period of time to reduce water usage, and I think we've also seen that in South Africa as well. Annually, we use more water in summertime because we bath, shower more, we water our gardens more, but we do flush our toilets less, and that's because I think that's because we perspire more over the summer, so we need to go to the toilets slightly less. We tend to use more water at the weekends inside our households, and that's because we're more sociable, and we want to have a shower or whatever before we go out to socialise. And there's also daily peaks in water usage in mornings and in the evenings. So the top slide shows how devices like washing machines and dishwashers, they've reduced substantially the amount of water they use, and I think they also do a better job as well now as well. So that's great that each device uses less water, but over that period, 1970 to 1998, illustrated there, the amount of these devices in households, well, the likelihood of a household having these devices has increased substantially. So they're using less water, but there's much more of them. And the bottom slide talks about rise in demand, so let's look at this in more detail. So the red line you could see here shows, this is for Colorado River Basin, shows rise in demand for water over time. And I think that, although this is not a UK setting, it does show the kind of rise in demand we're speaking about, and that particularly because of economic development, but perhaps also due to population growth. But the problem they have is not untypical in that you can see that the blue line is water supply. So if you look at 38 going forward, water supply, if a gross generalisation, but water supply has stayed relatively constant, but water demand is increasing. And what this is saying is we've now reached this unsustainable situation where demand is outstripping supply, and that's where you start to get problems. Right, so this is data from the Netherlands in 1994, and if we look at the two graphs on the left first, the top graph shows typical water demand. Top graph shows typical water demand, and then the lower graph shows water demand during a football match. And what you see is at half time and at full time there's big peaks, and that's because all the people are watching the football, some of whom might have been drinking beer at the time, rush to go to the toilet, or perhaps if they've not been drinking beer, make themselves a cup of tea at half time, and then the same happens again at the end of the match. So obviously the water supply company has to supply that water, which is relatively straightforward, but then all those extra people going to the toilet, preparing food, etc., that also results in more foul water supply to the drainage network. And the same is true on the right, where you see a typical profile, and then that's compared to the profile during the football match. Now, what's interesting about this is that the one on the left, it was actually in the very early hours of the morning, so 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, and the one on the right is later in the evening. But still, at both those times, even though you'd think people are quite likely to be watching the Netherlands versus Saudi Arabia, at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, there's still enough people there to sort of change the supply and demand profiles. For those that are keen, I've provided links to the highlights of both those football matches there. Wonder YouTube. Now, these graphs look at the water usage in two different supply districts in, I think it's Melbourne in Australia. And what you see here is this compares summer and winter uses for baths, toilets, tap use, dishwashers, clothes and irrigation. So you can see the substantial, particularly for irrigation actually, the substantial differences between the two types. Now the two plots on the right are for shower use in these areas. Now CWW and YVW are different water companies, and now there is a link to the paper there, but the difference between the graphs to some extent is due to the fact that these companies are supplying different socioeconomic or different types of development. One of the developments had more swimming pools, so it meant having more swimming pools meant that people are less likely to use the shower in the same way, because they use the pool to cool down rather than perhaps the shower, etc. So it's that interaction that gives you the difference between two water companies. But I think some of the other messages in the data are quite interesting. So first of all, if we draw quite a crude line through the data in the upper plot, so it would look something like that, it shows that where water temperature is higher, shower duration use tends to be lower. So for a water supply company, that tells you that, well, you're going to have to supply more water for showers in the winter time, but people are in them longer because they're using the shower to warm themselves up, and plus they can't face going out into their colder house, and then the sewerage network has to cope with those extra flows. And then if you look at the frequency of showers in the bottom plot, you can see that people, but although they're having shorter showers when it's warmer, they're having more showers when it's warmer, because their body temperature is higher, they're perhaps sweating more, so they feel a bit uncomfortable. That's a polite way of putting it, so that they're having a shower to sort of refresh. Now, memory serves me right, these dots down here, these are the properties where the people tended to have swimming pools, and so the swimming pool negated the need to have those extra showers to refresh, apparently. It's quite interesting work. It's worth looking at if you're interested. So this graph shows domestic wastewater levels in sewerage systems. So a lot of this we're talking about supply to households, but remember, really this part of the course is about thinking about the inputs to the system. So all those different inputs, this is what you end up with, is this flow pattern in the sewerage system. So it's really the dark line, which I'll highlight quite quickly, so please excuse if I wander off the line a bit. It's really just this line we're looking at just now. So what you see is that during the, let's see if I can change the colour of my pen. During the evening, there's not much happening because people are asleep. Okay, some people get up. Obviously, there's still things happening overnight. So some people have wash machines running. There's still commercial, industrial processes ongoing, but the vast majority of the people are asleep over that time period. Obviously, you still get people getting up during the night to go to the toilet, etc. But things calm right down. And then once we get into, well, in this plot, it's 8 o'clock. Which I would say is perhaps a little bit late, but it might be due to the difference between British Summer Time and GMT. What you see here is that you get this massive peak, and really what this is at that time of day, that's people, they're waking up, and by and large the first thing people do after they've woken up, after they've checked their phone, is they go to the toilet, they maybe have a shower, they brush their teeth, they make themselves something to eat. And all those things consume water and result in discharges to the wastewater system. So that's what you see here. So virtually everywhere I've ever seen, the peak in flow happens on that morning peak. Then, that morning time, sorry, then people go off to work and things calm down a bit. You get a little peak over lunchtime. Then people come back from work and they'll have a shower and they make themselves something to eat, and then later in the evening they go into bed. Okay, so so young people will keep watching this video, students in particular, will be thinking that this isn't the life you lead. But once you leave university, you get a job, this is the life you lead. You get up in the morning, you get washed, you go to work, you come back, you have something to eat, watch TV for a bit, and you go to bed. So that's the routine, and that routine results in this discharge profile. So when we're looking at this, if you're thinking about capacity, is that this is the capacity you're having to ensure your system can meet. So this is your peak and fill flows. And so when you talk about the 6 dry weather flow, it's designed to accommodate this sort of worst case scenario for dry weather flow levels. The other lines on the graphs are the pollutant loads associated with the different inflow rates. So you can see that although you do have this massive increase in flow at the 8 AM time, the pollutant levels doesn't quite pick up at the same rate, and that's because of a lot of the processes, the showers, etc., don't come with significant pollutant loads. So the TSS is the solids going into the network. So you can see that whilst the TSS levels increased from, I don't know, around 200 up to 500, so it's went up by 1.5 times. The flow rates went up 20 times or so, and that's because a lot of the flows coming in don't carry those heavy polluting loads, so it's more dilutive, if you like. And actually, according to this, you can see that the TSS level stays broadly constant through the day, which is quite interesting. Now this is the same graph, but it's by usage device. So this data is maybe about 10 years old, so it's perhaps a little out of date, but you can see that the big user in the morning is the WC, washing machine, then the kitchen sink, then the shower. So you can see that how the usage levels are. So at the peak time, so we draw, yep. I have to say I've never switched on a washing machine in the morning when I get out of bed. Well, never say never, but it's not something that's on my mind. But you can see that's the usage levels in the morning. And I envy people who have got time in the morning to have a bath. Okay, but perhaps that's because they don't have a shower fitted in their property. One of the great things about sewer systems is there's someone's always done a survey which tells you something interesting about it. And this is flushes per 100 people per 10 minutes. Quite a strange statistic. And again, what this looks at is the difference between weekday and weekends. So you can see that in the weekday, more people are getting up at the same time, but the weekend, you've got this longer, more attenuated peak. So people are getting up a little bit later, and people are getting up, just whenever they feel like it. Whereas during the week, people are getting up to, catch the bus to work or get their kids to school at time and all the rest of it. And this is stranger still. So this is number of sheets of toilet paper used per 100 people per 10 minutes. This data is more recent. This is for cocaine in wastewater. So like I say, people have done all sorts of surveys, and this was tracked in Hong Kong to look at cocaine usage. And I know there's been work done to estimate the amount of cocaine used in cities right across the world based on sampling wastewater and also water in rivers, because the sewage systems are discharged, to try and estimate roughly what the illegal drug use is in areas. The paper this came from also looked at different kinds of drugs which is detected in the wastewater system. So estimating file flows so we do that based on water consumption in similar catchments, and we have to be careful to exclude supply network leakage. So the water supply company will tell you, as a drainage engineer, how much water he is or she is supplying to a town or city, but that engineer's pipe work leaks all over the place, so you have to be careful that you size your network to account for usage, not supply, if that makes sense. So BSEN 752/2017, which should be on Vision, gives values for typical per capita average use. UK flows are normally noted as being 150 to 300 litres per head per day, and the peak is 6 times dry weather flow. For design of adoptable sewers for new housing, BSEN 1916933 notes that UK sewage undertakers usually specify a design flow of 4,000 litres per dwelling per day. So it used to be that a lot of focus would be on this figure when it came to estimating flows, but in recent years that's moved on in the UK, well, practice has moved on in the UK to set a level per household. And obviously that level is not just about usage, it's also about accommodating future increases in water usage as well. So that's for developments in general. Obviously, for industrial and commercial processes, you would speak to the users or do some research to try and estimate what the likely flows from those would be. Some commercial and industrial water users, even though they might be heavy users themselves, they might offer, or a water supply company might ask them to treat their own effluents where there's particular pollutants in them, or where there's really large volumes So they can have their own treatment processes, and they can then have the right to discharge either pre-treated water to the sewerage network or treated water back to the environment. So where predicting water usage becomes quite interesting is in large institutions. So if you're doing the supply network for, I don't know, a very large hotel or an exhibition centre, you know, so a large concert venue, say, or a football stadium, what you're interested there in is you're really interested in the peaks. And so this is why I've got the picture of a ladies WC here, which isn't a particularly large one. But what you're interested in when you're sizing larger facilities like a large hotel is actually what is the peak flow going to be? What is the likelihood of, you know, obviously it's unlikely that everyone in the hotel is going to get up exactly the same time and flush the toilet and have a shower at the same time. So you do some probability work in order to understand what the capacity of the system has to be around that. If there's lots of work being done in, you know, amusement parks and airports as well as another one to try because facilities in these kind of places tend to be used quite heavily, because when people are on holiday or travelling, their normal routines are upset, so they're perhaps drinking and eating more, and that means they end up using the WCs in different ways. I'm sure you're familiar with the kind of situation I'm trying to talk about. And so it's quite important to think through quite carefully, and for those large inputs to your system, what the kind of peak flows are likely to be, and also what the pollutant loading within them is going to be. So commercial demand for drinking, food preparation and washing and sanitary facilities are what you're interested in. Industrial demand from industrial process should also be considered. Now, this data is from 2006-07, so a little bit dated, but it's still quite interesting, and it shows for different sectors of the economy what the water usage levels is. So the orange colour, that's water which is abstracted from the environment by these commercial industrial users, and then either returned to the environment, cleaned up hopefully, or put into the sewerage system. You can see that in technical terms, a big user is actually leakage from the network. So the water supply company is, you know, if you look at it in this term, is actually one of the bigger users of treated water in the water that's leaked from the network. But if we remove the abstracted water and we remove the leakage from this graph, this is what you see. So as you'd expect, you know, hotels, education, health and social work there are big users. So that's basically schools and hospitals are big users of water. And you're not surprised to see, you know, food and drink there as well. So this research is from the States, so this is why the units are in gallons per square foot, which I just can't get my head around. So 1 gallon per square foot is around 49.5 litres per metre squared. And you can see here, if you look at it in those terms, it's it's healthcare which is the big user, and that's because of all the, you know, all the work to keep the place nice and clean, and also the work to do the laundry and all the rest of it as well in these buildings. So infiltration is something else I spoke about in terms of inputs. So you have to try and quantify this for your network, and you also have to think ahead to think what the likely infiltration rates are going to be. So it's an issue because it results in a reduction in sewer capacity and can cause premature CSO activation. So typically infiltration will range from 0.01 to 1 meters cube per day per millimetre of pipe diameter per kilometre. So it can equal up to 50% of dry weather flow, and sometimes more. Obviously that would be quite unusual. So what it's saying is your infiltration is related to the time, so that's with the day. Millimetre pipe diameter, why that's important is because obviously a big pipe diameter has more space for cracks, etc. to appear, and also length, because the cracks appear over that length as well, so it can be quite substantial. Okay, so where you get issues, and it's illustrated to some extent here, is where you have root damage to pipe networks. So as well as aging pipe networks, you have root damage, where the roots find their way in and prise open small gaps. Traffic loading can be a big issue, and if particularly the pipe's near the surface, traffic loading can result in deterioration of the pipe network as well, and also where it's been poorly laid or designed or constructed. So this goes back, the top slide is one I shared with you earlier, where we were looking at the flow rate and the peak at 8 AM. Now, the bottom slide is the same data, but it's been reinterpreted with infiltration removed. So what you see is, once we remove infiltration, so here that the flow rate with infiltration is very low during the night. If we remove infiltration, it goes down to almost zero. But what is also interesting is when you remove that flow, because remember, water infiltrating into the sewage system has very low levels of pollutants and suspended material in it. So when you remove that flow, the pollutant levels during the night essentially trend towards the area, the level we see pretty much throughout the day, which I think is kind of interesting. Yeah, I've been in sewage systems during the evening, and it's quite interesting. It's always interesting, but it's quite interesting in that during the evening, because there's less foul inputs to the system, the water is much clearer, and because more of the water in the sewer is proportionately more of it is infiltrated water as opposed to water that's come from domestic properties, the temperature also goes down as well. So by and large, being in a sewer system, they're not warm places, but you seldom feel that cold, apart from during that nighttime period where you've got less commercial, industrial and residential inputs, and a higher proportion of the water is made up of infiltration. System conditions quite important. These pictures are from the Sewerage Rehabilitation Manual, and what they show is different levels of degradation through from pipes that look relatively okay through to ones there's obvious problems with. I think what's happened over the last 10 or 20 years is the sewerage operators have a much better idea of the condition of pipe networks, and they know where investment's required. Whereas 20, 30 years ago, you only really found out about problems once you only really found out about the condition of a network once there was a significant problem, and you went into the network and you could see that it really required investment. But much more pipe networks have had CCTV down them now, and they've got condition classification set up. So estimation methods for infiltration tend to utilise flow data recording during dry weather flow by subtracting the base flow from site measured flow. So often these involve going into the sewer network at night time, like I was talking about earlier, and looking at the flows at that time of night and comparing that to the rest of the day. But this can fail to take into account what's called rainfall-induced infiltration. So this is where if you've got quite a lot of rainfall over a long period of time, as that water seeps through the ground and reaches the pipe, you'll then get an increase in infiltration. where it's less diffuse, so where that means where you actually got, like the video I showed you in the last class, where you've got a point source of infiltration, you can detect it using CCTV, but a lot of it is just slowly seeping into the network. And yeah, so that's the point source I showed you the last time. We expect infiltration to vary throughout the year, and this is shown in these graphs here. It's partly because you have more rainfall at certain times of the year, and also because groundwater level tends to increase over the winter period. So exfiltration. So infiltration is water moving from the groundwater into the sewer. Exfiltration is water, or sewage perhaps, moving from the pipe or the sewer into groundwater. So obviously this happens where this tends to happen where the pipe is above the groundwater level, whereas the infiltration into the pipe tends to happen where the pipe is below the groundwater level. So the detecting infiltration or measuring infiltration is a little bit more difficult than detecting exfiltration is a little bit more difficult than detecting infiltration. Because if we think, well, I'm going to draw it up here. So if we've got a pipe, and say we put dye in the pipe up here, and we measure the dye level here. If there was, just say we had infiltration flows coming in here through a crack in the pipe, we've got a known dye concentration on the left hand side. The infiltration groundwater comes into the sewer pipe. That reduces the dye concentration. So we measure it here, we've picked up a lower concentration of dye, and that tells us that flows coming into the pipe network. Now, if we have the same setup, but this time we've got exfiltration, so the water's leaving the sewer. We've got a known dye concentration on the left. Flow is leaving the sewer, but when we measure the dye concentration on the right, the concentration is still the same. So this means you can't use that kind of test, but what you can do is if you measure the flow rate here and the flow rate there, or also measure the dye concentrations, you work at the total mass of the dye, or a total volume of dye you can do, and that's what's happening here in this text here to describe how you can identify exfiltration. So it's a little bit more complex, and you do need much more accurate equipment, I think. This slide shows a summary of recent microbiological contamination of groundwater beneath UK major cities. Tends to be that these nasty microbes don't last that long in the groundwater because the groundwater salts tend to kill them off, but nonetheless they can be an issue. But it's not as serious. It's a serious issue, but it can often be hard to detect, is what I'm trying to say. And this table summarises some estimates of exfiltration for different UK or different EU cities. This paper that this comes from should be linked on Vision if you're interested in looking at this. So this data is from an experimental setup looking at exfiltration under 3 scenarios. So free draining exfiltration rate, so that's a pipe just with a hole in it. And then with dry gravel exfiltration rate, so that's a pipe with a hole in it and there's dry gravel at the other side of the hole. And then the triangular plot is wet gravel at the other side of the hole. So you can see that under those three different scenarios, you've got quite different exfiltration rates. And so that none of them are particularly realistic, of course, but it does show you that it's not just the size of the hole in the pipe that's important, it's also the soil around the pipe. Now this is even more interesting, I think, because here we're looking at, let's not get hung up in the detail, and again this should be on vision, is we're looking at small holes in the pipe with actual live sewage, and we're looking at the rate at which the water is flowing through that. So it's different shapes of holes. So there's a round one, there's a rectangular one, horizontal rectangle, and a vertical rectangle, and they're looking at how the rate at which the flow goes through these. And what you see is that for most of them, so the test here is over 80 minutes. They set it up, run the sewage through, and they measure the rate at which the flow comes through. But the key message here isn't really about the shape of the hole, so that's a bit of a distraction. The key message here is for all of them, and it was, the flow rate starts off high, and it goes down to very low indeed, quite quickly, so over the space of 80 minutes. So you could assume that, for some reason a hole appears in the wall of a pipe, and it's a nice 10mm hole. Quite quickly you start off with an exfiltration rate of 0.14 litres per second, if we look at that, the blue line I've just highlighted. So that's reasonably high, but then within an hour or so, that exfiltration rate's down to about 1/100th of that. So why is that? Why would that happen? And now it's because of the solids in the flow, particularly the toilet tissue. So as toilet tissue goes through the pipe network, it breaks down, and when you're in the sewer it looks like a kind of a loose pulp that's just washing it along the system. Things like wet pipes tend to hold together and they cause problems, but toilet tissue tends to break down quite quickly, as you can imagine. The broken down toilet tissue and other solid material in the flows basically clog those little exfiltration holes. So smaller holes should cause the system less of an issue because they quite quickly clog. Obviously there's lots of them, that's an issue. If you've got a more substantial hole, it's much more difficult to deal with. But for a lot of smaller holes, it's to some extent the problem fixes itself. Not entirely, of course, but you can see here that you've got quite a substantial reduction in the exfiltration rate over quite a small period of time, I think. So you've got point source input of wastewater has been shown to be a serious threat to groundwater. Okay, so that's wastewater going into groundwater it's a serious threat, as it is related to the contamination with fecal bacteria. Nobody wants fecal bacteria in their groundwater. Despite the short survival time of chloroform bacteria, so that's these quite dangerous bacteria, they don't survive that long in groundwater. They can be rapidly transported, and untreated can be a substantial risk to human health. But the problem is that it can be difficult to identify where the bacteria has come from, so you can't always be sure it's come from the sewer network. Now what the graph on the right shows is the researchers in this study drew the conclusion that fecal bacteria, you couldn't be sure that you couldn't link that to the sewerage system they were looking at. So what they developed another indicator, and that indicator was caffeine, because by and large in the environment caffeine doesn't exist in the quantities that it does in sewage, or because we drink so much of the stuff, and so much of it goes down the sink as well. Now the top graph is something called paraxanthine. Right, so what is this? Now, in our bodies, when you consume caffeine, your body converts it to paraxanthine. So that paraxanthine is an indicator that someone has drunk some coffee, they went to the toilet afterwards, and they flushed it down the toilet. So by tracing this chemical, it's a way for the operators to identify where sewage systems are contaminating groundwater, and that's a better indicator than tracking the coliform bacteria because it's short-lived and it's hard to identify exactly where it's come from. Wow, so that's class 2B done. I hope you've enjoyed it and I hope you found it interesting, and thirdly I hope you have learned something along the way. So class 1 was introduction, class 2 we've looked at different system types, and we've also looked at the estimating flows to the system, and we've also looked at combined separate systems, CSOs, and estimating flows into the system. So that means you're almost ready to start thinking about the assessment for this course. So here's a couple of SAQs, so self-assessment questions. So let's look at these quite briefly. First question is compare and contrast the mechanisms and implications of exfiltration, infiltration, and inflow. So I'm not going to go over this just now, but I hope that by now you know what exfiltration is, you know what infiltration is, and you know what inflow is. And for each of those things, you know the impact it has on the sewerage system or the wider environment, and also how you would go around measuring, particularly for infiltration and exfiltration, how you'd go around measuring or estimating the inflows of these to the system. Self-assessment question 2. Combined sewerage systems, separate drainage systems, and sustainable drainage systems are all commonly used in the UK. Explain why they were introduced and the merits and problems associated with them in draining urban runoff. So particular attention should be paid to the underlying design philosophy rather than simply listing differences between the system. So a good way of thinking about answering this question is to think about the transition, if you like. So a simple way of looking at this is we started off with combined systems, and remember how I spoke about how these were really these started off as water courses which people were discharging to, which became covered over, and they were the first combined systems. The problem with combined systems, well, a key problem is CSOs, and how then we transitioned to the separate systems because they removed the need for CSOs, but separate systems didn't really remove the environmental impact associated with pollutants getting washed off urban surfaces and on into urban watercourses and other receiving water bodies. And so really the solution to that problem is sustainable urban drainage systems, and have a think about how they solve that problem. So a couple of questions there. Please do spend, I'm not saying you should write down a big long answer, but please do spend a bit of time thinking about these questions, and as well as the black and white of the answer, think about the issues around it, about the challenges they face and how engineers in the past have went around to try to reduce them. It's well worth, there'll be a couple of articles on Vision talking about exfiltration, infiltration. It's worth having a look at them and also thinking about the wider implications. There have been lots of studies tried to quantify and mitigate their impacts, so it's worth having a look at that. It's quite interesting work sometimes. Okay, goodbye for now. I hope you've enjoyed this lecture, and I'll see you again for lecture 3, or class 3, sorry. Bye for now.